Hello, everybody. Danky here with another episode about climate change. And I know I said last episode I was going to be talking about imperialism, but I realized I left out some very important effects that climate change has. And one of them is, of course, uh, the acidification of our oceans. This is perhaps the most damaging effect, besides, of course, the erosion of the ozone layer that climate change will have on our planet. Um, for those of you who aren't familiar, there's a process on our planet called the carbon cycle. Um, all living creatures breathe in air, oxygen, and breathe out carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide's also, you know, put into the atmosphere when trees burn or factories burn fossil fuels or volcanoes erupt, uh, and the gradually the CO2 gets recycled back down into the soil, sometimes in the form of coal, uh, and into the water sometimes, where marine creatures will convert this into the calcium used to form their own shells. Um, and then once those creatures die, it forms vast deposits of uh, shells on the ocean floor, which then solidify and form like a limestone type ocean bottom. So by those means, carbon gets sort of trapped uh, on our planet, in our soil, and in the bottom of our oceans. But unfortunately, we are pumping in more and more carbon into the atmosphere, and it's leading to increasingly higher amounts of carbon dioxide in our oceans, more than the marine creatures can take out by making shells and dying and being deposited as limestone. So this is an extremely um, critical threat because of the process of photosynthesis. Um, Photosynthesis is when plants take in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen. But due to climate change, a great majority of plants, at least on the land, will die due to the conditions we talked about previously, like desertification, um, but also just increasing temperatures, and just uh, a sea level rise, and all kinds of shifts in climate will render many plant species completely unable to adapt, and they will go extinct. And but a lot of people misunderstand the process of photosynthesis, that the let's see that the majority of the photosynthesis on our planet doesn't take place on land. um if all the land plants on earth were wiped out by climate change, I'm sure most terrestrial life would probably die along with it. But the marine world uh might be fine, uh, were it not for the acidification of the oceans. And the reason why is because the majority of photosynthesis on our planet is done by cyanobacteria that lives in our water. Um, they Algae are responsible for a vast majority. Green algae is responsible for the vast majority of photosynthesis on our planet, and um, with changing pH levels in our ocean, uh, it and changing temperatures, it makes it harder for species to survive, and the constraints that it put it on certain species can be enough to destroy them. And so, just the sheer threat and stress this puts on the biodiversity, including the critical biodiversity, such as like the cyanobacteria in the water, and the algae in water that does the majority of the photosynthesis. It's really a pretty big deal. Um, the loss of the land is something that's almost survivable, almost, but the loss of the oceans, that kind of cuts off our final lifeline. Um, you know, it, it sounds like kind of like a hellscape world, almost trying to imagine this future. Um, it's like vast civil projects would have to be undertaken to set up like vast protected areas, like the size of entire countries, just to ensure that enough like algae survive to keep the normal photosynthetic processes going. Like there would have to be just enormous like entire uh just huge regions of forests planted to sort of try to replenish the or get rid of the amount of carbon we have. And so it's just with that in mind, uh, just the sheer lack in availability in land that's going to be inhabitable in the future is going to propel those um, shielded, modernized, capitalistic countries like in the West in our future world age of climate change scenario. It's going to incentivize them to invade whichever regions those like Goldilocks zones can be found in. So while and it's kind of tragic in that aspect, because it's like the few areas that haven't been completely ravaged by climate change are going to just become the battlefields of the future wars. Um, so, if anything, they'll probably be reduced to wastelands too, unless countries will just mutually agree, like, oh, we won't bomb this territory for the good of the human race. I mean, that might have to be some kind of a solution that comes into effect. Like, there might just have to be an entire, like, uh, countrywide area that is just a protected giant forest. Um, or say like the Great Lakes of the United States are just converted into a great like algae colony in order to sustain the vital photosynthesis rates that we need. So, I mean, all of this seems very abstract, but um, these are all processes that are predicted by climatologists, and the models are showing that like this kind of thing is not only likely to happen, but this is probably what is going to happen. So what I'm sort of doing with this thought experiment is like taking what scientists are sure is going to sort of be the result of climate change and sort of trying to get a sense of the socio-political implications of that, especially with regards to what that means for the socialist movement. Um, so, I mean, the socialist movement is going to have to prepare itself for a huge amount of obstacles in this age of climate change. Not only will they have to contend with the last vestiges of global capitalism as it tries to hang on, because capitalism won't go out uh, with dignity. It will go out screaming and clawing, and it will fight every single step of the way. Uh, Capitalism is like the rabid dog that you have to just wrestle with in order to put down. It turns into an animal, especially once it gets towards the end. Uh, Once socialism really, the world socialist revolution really starts taking into effect, you'll really see the sheer brutality of capitalism come out, especially under the constraints of climate change. Um, and so, in that aspect, I think another advice to give to the socialists of the future age of climate change is don't resort to just complete and utter butchery. Because, I mean, after all, we have to save uh, our species, and many of the other species on our planet uh, now sort of rely on us to sort of correct these climate errors we've made via vast civil engineering projects like planting giant forests. So, a lot of creatures kind of need us to achieve the socialist revolution as well as humans. Um, Lots of species sort of rely on humans to survive is generally what I'm trying to say, and even more so is the case with climate change. We'll probably have to set up vast protected uh, parks for these animals, and I'm sure extinction will increase exponentially. But back to topic. So these socialist nations will have to walk a very fine line, like not to resort to barbarism and butchery, because not only are they going to have to contend with the capitalist, not only are they going to have to probably defend the few fertile lands they have left from like capitalist invasion and imperialism, but they are also going to have to deal with like factionalism and intertribal warfare that results from like uh, fractured alliances and the scarcity of resources. Um, because unfortunately, when people are pushed to the point of desperation, all bets are off, and people start behaving uh, towards their most base and animal of instincts, and the same could be said towards the actions of countries. If a country is deprived of the resources it needs, it will begin to act on its most base standard of instincts. And I would hate to see a uh, once hopeful proletarian world socialist movement turn into just a great butcher, a great massacre, simply because it lacked the organization and the will to uh, uh, put forth a socialist revolution that uh, was one of true ethics, one that really respected human life. And I think, respect for human life is pretty much like one of the central key tenets to socialism. So I think, you know, um, so all that being said, uh, the age of climate change, I haven't really talked about like this third world socialist revolution. Um, and the potential for other countries to become members of it. I mean, of course, there's former Eastern Bloc countries that will probably look back to the USSR, especially once climate change really pushes the constraints of global capitalism to its breaking point, and we may indeed see a return of the USSR. And if that does happen, it would certainly make tackling climate change a whole lot easier, because then we would have just sort of like a central coordinated like effort, uh, and like, but this is pretty much just a giant wet dream. This I you know w- any thing like this is sort of unlikely to happen. um I might as well wish for cows to have chocolate milk, but that's, as far as everything else, uh, we might be able to expect like Eastern Bloc countries to adopt socialism once more, because I mean, after all, they've had it in their history, and in living, maybe not in living memory by the time climate change is really into effect, but at least like it would be part of their history. People might remember, you know, there is another way. There's not just this neoliberal, or in the case of the future, like the fascistic, ultra nationalistic uh, path. Um, and then and uh, uh, undeveloped, impoverished countries, they might realize, well, we don't need these warlords to boss us around, because I'm sure that once the organized governments of all of these um, uh, more impoverished, less developed nations, they're just going to collapse. And so I'm sure once they collapse, it'll just resort to the control of like local warlords. So it becomes like a a point where, uh if a proletarian revolution does come about in one of these countries, it's going to have to keep the momentum going, and keep spreading the revolution until it gets enough holdings to firmly cement its place in the global um in the global power structure. It needs to cement a foothold, uh, because otherwise it would just be ganged up on by these ultranationalist capitalist, remnant countries of the old world. Um, so I'm going like into full blown like Star Wars territory here. Um, I don't want to speculate um, much past the immediate uh, like triggerings of climate change, like the next century, say. I don't want to predict what I think is going to happen like after the year 2100, because I the way that technology grows, it's impossible. People in the 1890s thought that by the time we live in now, we would have flying cars and be living like on Venus. But I mean, obviously, nobody can really foresee how technology um, will change. And I think that's actually a good topic for another video, is how technology plays a role in the socialist revolution. So um, stay tuned for that. Um, and thank you for watching.